Nitzavim. The end of this coming week Sedra. So after mentioning about the Mitzvah of Chiva, according to some Rishonim, about the Mitzvah of learning Torah, or the observance of the whole Torah, the Torah says, "Re'eina sati l'fenecha hayom es hachayim v'es hatov v'es hamoves v'es hara." Behold, see that I gave before you today chayim, life, and good, and moves, death, and bad. And this pasuk tells us how freedom of choice in the sense person is not compelled to sin. A person is not compelled to do mitzvahs. A person chooses to do mitzvahs. A person chooses to sin. And consequently, he is punished for his choice or rewarded for his choice. And it's interesting, Rashi on this pasuk says, "Es hachayim v'es hatov, zeh toli b'zeh." For life and good, one is dependent upon the other. In tasatov, if you will do good, harei lecha chayim, so you will have life. In tasara, and if you will do bad, harei lecha hamaves, then you will have death. Now it's somewhat strange, the words of Rashi, because it would appear from Rashi that when God says, "I give you life," so life is a reward for the good that you do. And when it says, "I give you death," death is a punishment for the bad that you do. And the pasuk seems to have it in the opposite order. The pasuk says, I gave you life and good. If good, acting properly, is the cause of life, it should have said first, "Es hatov v'es hachayim," the good and the life, because the reward comes after the deeds that you did. And v'es hamoves v'es hara should have said the bad and the death, because the death is a punishment for acting in an improper manner. So we have to understand the order in the Torah, at least according to Rashi. And then later on, a couple psukim later on, God sets heaven and earth, in other words, nature, as the witnesses to his commitment about reward and punishment. And you shall choose life. Some say it's a advice that God is giving. Some seem to imply, no, that there is a special mitzvah, you shall choose life. But the question is, it seems, if life is the reward, the Torah should say, "Uvacharta batov," you shall choose the good, and as a reward, you will get life. Now, this question can be understood from another perspective altogether. It's true that if a person does a mitzvah shelo lishma, he does a mitzvah for an ulterior motive. And an ulterior motive doesn't just mean that he does the mitzvah because he's paid to do the mitzvah, or that he does the mitzvah in order to receive honor. But we see that even if a person does a mitzvah because he wants the reward for the mitzvah, that's considered shelo lishma. He does have he's credited, I should say, with the accomplishment of doing the mitzvah. And he might receive a reward for doing the mitzvah. But that's not the preferred manner. So how is it that the Torah tells us, Uvacharta b'chayim, you shall choose life. You shall choose the reward rather than the punishment. How are we to understand it? And even if we say, as some of the commentaries say, that Chayim has reference to the everlasting life of Olam Haba, of the world to come. Even if we say it has reference to Olam Haba, but the everlasting life of Olam Haba, that's also considered Shalol Lishma. The Rambam at the beginning of Perek Yud, as I'll bring out later, he says explicitly, a person when he does mitzvahs should not say that I am doing the mitzvahs in order to get Olam Haba. A person should do the mitzvahs because it's a command of God, because he wants to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the question is, so why does the Torah say, Uvacharta b'chayim, and you shall choose life, which is the reward? After all, the ideal approach is, Uvacharta b'tov, you shall choose to do good. You shall choose to do what God told you to do, what God wants you to do. Why Uvacharta b'chayim? You shall choose the reward of life. And as I mentioned, this question could be answered against the Rambam also, because the Rambam in Perek Zayin, in the 7th Perek of Hilchos Chiva, he says, and this question was asked by my uncle. The Rambam could be interpreted in a different way, but I'm now going to interpret the Rambam the way my uncle read the Rambam, and I'll mention the question, but I'm going to suggest my own answer. Hoel v'rishus kol adam nesunala, k'moshe be'arnu. Inasmuch as every person has the choice, as we explained, Yishtadel Adam Lasos Chiva, a person should try to do Chiva, Ulehisvados Befiv Mechatov, Ulunayar Kapov Mechatov. A person should try to do Chiva and to rid his hands of his sins. Kadesh Yamus, in order that he should die, the hu bal tshuva, and he's a bal tshuva, the yiske lechaye olam haba, and he will merit to get olam haba. And the way my uncle read the Rambam is saying that that's the reason you should do tshuva. It's not the Rambam is not just telling us that if you do tshuva, you will get olam haba. The Rambam is telling us that you should do tshuva in order to get Olam Haba. That should be the purpose. That should be part of the purpose of doing tshuva. And as I mentioned before, the Rambam in Perek Yud of Hilchos Tshuva says, Al Yomar Adam Hareini Yosef Mitzvahs HaTorah. A person shouldn't say, I'm doing the mitzvahs of the Torah, Va'osek b'chachmasa, and I'm involved in its wisdom. Kidei shakabel kol habrachos haksuvos ba, in order that I should get all the blessings that are associated with. Or kidei she'eske l'chaya olam haba. A person should not have an attitude that the reason I'm doing the mitzvahs is because I want Olam Haba. Because Olam Haba is considered an ulterior motive. So how is it on one hand, the Rambam seems to say that in Perek Zayin, that a person should do Chiva in order that he should get Olam Haba. And on the other hand, the Rambam says that one should not do mitzvahs In doing mitzvahs, he should not have the attitude that I am doing the mitzvahs in order to get Olam Haba, in order to get the reward. And there is a question that is related to this question. The Rambam does not mention in the Minyan HaMitzvos, in his count of the mitzvos, I'll get into it a little bit later, he does not mention the Mitzvah of Chiva, he mentions the Mitzvah of Vidui. The Ramban, he counts as two separate mitzvahs. One mitzvah is Chiva. The Mitzvah of Chiva, of course, is to regret the past, to commit oneself internally to change his ways. And the mitzvah of Vidui, that's a mitzvah of saying the confessional prayer. So the Ramban counts it as two separate mitzvahs. The Rambam only mentions the mitzvah of Vidui. Now, the Rambam in Sefer Mitzvahs cites a Sifri Zuta, and the Sifri Zuta says, how do I know that one can perform the mitzvah of Vidui, of saying the confessional prayer in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel? In other words, on the basis of logic, if not for a special Zeres HaKosov, if not for a special pasuk that indicated otherwise, I would have said that in order to perform the mitzvah of Vidui, a person has to go to Eretz Yisrael to perform the mitzvah of Vidui. But the pasuk says in the Tochacha, "V'zvadu es chatosam v'chatos abosam," that a person who sinned, that eventually the Jewish people, after all the terrible things that overtake them because of their sins, they will say vidui, they will say confessional prayer, they will admit to their sins and to the sins of their forefathers. And the pasuk is talking about the Jew of Chutz La'aretz, the Jew who was already chased out of the land of Eretz Yisrael from generations before. So we see that the mitzvah vidui, the Sifri Zuta says, and it's cited by the Rambam, the mitzvah vidui can be performed outside the land of Israel. But if not for that pasuk, I would have suggested that the mitzvah of vidui would have had to be performed in Eretz Yisrael. Now, question is, what is the logic? What is the logic that the mitzvah of vidui should have had to be performed in Eretz Yisrael? Why would have I thought that if not for a special Zeres HaKosov and a special pasuk indicating otherwise, that I would have to go to Eretz Yisrael to fulfill the mitzvah of vidui, of saying the confessional prayer? Now, there is a machlokes. The Ramban, as I mentioned before, said that there are two separate mitzvahs in the Torah. One is in this week's Sedra, is a mitzvah of Chiva. V'shavta Hashem Elokecha, according to the Ramban, it's both a haftacha, it's a commitment that God tells the Jewish people, you shall return, you will return. And also, it's a command. You shall return. You have to return. It is your obligation to return. Why is it that the same pasuk is used to tell both? Why is it that we couldn't have had two separate psukim? I think the Torah wanted to emphasize that the reason there is a mitzvah to do tshuva is because we in doing tshuva, we have to know that we are capable of doing tshuva. The biggest roadblock from doing tshuva is the feeling that it's a lost cause, that I won't be able to do it. So the same words that tells us of the commitment of God to the Jewish people, that we will do tshuva. And as the Rambam says, the Torah has given a commitment, a promise that the Jewish people in the future will do tshuva. That same pasuk tells us that we are required to do tshuva. But we have to understand that we are capable of doing tshuva. But in any case, the Rambam, when he starts Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Tshuva says, mitzvos b'shel Torah, all the mitzvahs of the Torah, bein aseh, bein lo aseh, whether there's a positive commandment or a negative commandment, whether a person violated or transgresses one of them, bein b'zadam, bein b'shgaga, whether it's willingly or inadvertently, kishayaseh tshuva v'yoshev michata'ah, when he does tshuva and returns from his sin, chayav lehisbados lefnei hakel baruch hu, he is required to do vidui before God. So there are those who say the Meshech Chochmah, there's something similar in the Minchas Chinuch, that the Rambam's opinion, whereas the Ramban's opinion is that, let's say I did a sin, so the fact that I do not do tshuva for that sin is an additional sin. I'm violating the mitzvah once I realize that I sinned, and I don't do tshuva, so I am violating the requirement of doing tshuva. The Rambam Shita, according to the Meshech Chochmah, is different. The Rambam's opinion is that, according to the Meshech Chochmah, that if a person realizes he sins, so the sin remains. Tshuva was something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created to give man the ability to rid himself of his sins. But there is no requirement per se of doing tshuva. The sin that you do, that you did, that you still have. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the sin it repeats itself over and over and over. But there is no requirement, and so each time or for each moment, you are violating a mitzvah, but you're not in violation of the mitzvah of doing tshuva. Because tshuva was something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, the way the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim explains it, because if man felt that he could not rid himself of sin, he will indulge in doing more and more sins. So God gave man the opportunity to rid himself of these sins. But it's not a mitzvah per se. But once a person does do tshuva, and he says, I regret my sins, I will never do it again. I am embarrassed and ashamed of what I did before God. So then he has a requirement to stand before God and say, Ana Hashem, please God, I sinned. I admit I sinned. Please give me atonement. Please erase the sin. But the actual act of doing tshuva, the requirement of doing tshuva, there is no requirement. Just once you do tshuva, there is a requirement what you add to the tshuva. That is what the Meshech Chochmah writes. I was once at a discussion where Rav Moshe Dov Rifkin, Moshe Dov Ber Rifkin, he was Rosh Hashiva in Torah B'das, and he was from the greatest Talmidei Chachamim, and there was but he was also associated with Lubavitch. He was a Talmud of the Rashab, of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he was talking with my father, and he used to publish contradiction pamphlets of Chidushei Torah. And he mentioned to my father that he assumed that the Meshech Chochmah's interpretation of the Rambam was the correct interpretation. In other words, that according to the Rambam, there is no requirement to do tshuva. Only once a person does tshuva, once a person regrets, sincerely regrets, and decides he wants to change his life, then there is a mitzvah for him to do vidui. And he showed the kuntras, as he was his practice, whenever he came out with a new pamphlet of Chidushei Torah, which later all the pamphlets were put together to create a very large sefer of Chidushei Torah. So he brought it into the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe told him that he disagreed with this approach. And he felt that even according to the Rambam, there is a mitzvah of Chiva. And from my father, I heard, and Rav Rifkin mentioned that time to my father, that he saw that my uncle wrote that Reb Chaim felt differently also than he did. That Reb Chaim felt that there is a mitzvah of Chiva, but the mitzvah of Chiva and the mitzvah of vidui is one mitzvah. And the way my uncle explained it, it's like davening. The halach is that when one davens, certainly according to Reb Chaim, a person has to have kavanah. He has to have intention. So you have to know that you're standing before God. If a person just says the words of the davening, of the Shemona Esrei, without focusing or thinking that he's standing before God, he does not fulfill the mitzvah. So my uncle said, according to the way he explained Reb Chaim, that the Rambam says there's a mitzvah of vidui. But the mitzvah of vidui is a mitzvah of davening. You have to daven for forgiveness. And the davening of forgiveness manifests itself in an admission that I sinned, but I will not do it again. Every moment after I recognize that I sinned, I have this requirement of saying this special prayer, this special davening. And the davening encompasses not just the oralization of the words, but the kavanah as well. The understanding of that I'm standing before God and what I'm saying. So this is so it's all part of one mitzvah. So according to the Rambam, we see that the mitzvah of vidui is a mitzvah of Chiva. What is the essence of the mitzvah of Chiva? So the Rambam tells us that the essence of the mitzvah of Chiva Rambam Perek Zayin of Hilchos Chiva, Halacha Vav, the 7th chapter of Hilchos Chiva. Halacha Zayin. No. Kama mu'ula mailas halacha Zayin. Kama mu'ula mailas hatshuva. How exalted is the level of tshuva. Emish, yesterday, Zemuvdo mehashem elokei Yisrael. This person, the sinner, was separated from the God of Israel. Shenamar v'noseichem hayu mavdilim beinechem lebein elokeichem. Your sins separated between you and your God. So you cried out, and you were not answered. Shenemar ki sarbu tefillah. Even if you say, add to the tefillahs, add to the davening, I won't answer you. V'osa mitzvos v'torfin oso. And you do mitzvahs. And they rejected. So Shenamar BK Zos Miyetchem Remos Chatzeirai. God says, who asked this from you? I don't want it from you. And then he says, Bahayom, and today, now after he did Tshuva, Medubach B'Shechina, he is clinging onto the Shechina, onto the presence of God. And you cling to the God, your Lord. So you cry out to God and you're answered right away. And you do mitzvahs, and you do mitzvahs, and they're accepted with pleasure and joy. And God even desires your mitzvahs, the Rambam says. So what is tshuva? Tshuva is not atonement. Kapara is atonement. Tshuva is return. Tshuva is coming close to God, returning to God. And in its essence, when we think of Olam Haba, what is Olam Haba? Olam Haba, Chazal tell us, tzaddikim sit close, they derive benefit, pleasure, spiritual pleasure. There is no physical existence in Olam Haba. It's a spiritual existence. The soul of the human being is in Olam Haba, deriving spiritual pleasure from being close to God. So the essence of Olam Haba is closeness to God. So we can think of Olam Haba from two perspectives. On one hand, we can view Olam Haba from the perspective that it offers me the ultimate opportunity of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of closeness to God. On the other hand, and there are many who understand Olam Haba in that manner, that Olam Haba is a reward. And I don't want to be left out from that reward. They see Olam Haba as an honor in being together with the tzaddikim. It's almost, of course, it's a big difference, but it's the same attitude as people that always want to see their names signed together with Rabbanim, with Rosh Yeshivas, whatever it is. So there are people that view Olam Haba from that perspective. So if somebody views Olam Haba from the perspective of reward, of honor, or lack of disgrace, that's shalol lishma. That's an ulterior motive. If somebody views Olam Haba from the perspective of closeness to God, on the contrary, that's the essence of Chiva. What is Chiva? Chiva is coming close to God. There was a wall that separated the sinner from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now with his Chiva, he broke that wall. He says, the Rambam tells us in Halacha Vav that he's considered Ahov, his beloved. He's Nen, he is answered. So the essence of Chiva is returning to God. And we return to God, we want to feel close to God in this world, but we want to feel close to God in the next world also. That is appropriate, more than appropriate. That is what Chiva is all about. Chiva is about being close to God. And when the Rambam says you shouldn't do mitzvahs, and the truth is, all mitzvahs, even Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who has an altogether different explanation of Lishma by learning Torah, regarding learning Torah, but he says, in regard to other mitzvahs, when we talk about doing mitzvahs Lishma, it means dveikus. It means feeling close to God when you do the mitzvahs. So when we do mitzvahs because we want to sense a certain closeness to God, that is very appropriate. That's doing mitzvahs lishma. But if we do mitzvahs only because we want the reward of Olam Haba, we don't want the punishment of Gehenna Chas v'Shalom, you get Olam Haba, but that's not the proper perspective. The proper perspective is to do it lishma, without any ulterior motive. And I think that that's the explanation also in regard to Eretz Yisrael. Because where does one feel closest to God? One feels closest to God. One feels closest to God in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has Kedusha Shechina, as the Kapta V'Ferach says. From the time that Avraham Avinu came to Eretz Yisrael, even during the Churban, and even according to those who say that the Dusha for mitzvos did not exist after the Churban, that there's no mitzvah of Trumos or Maisros. But Eretz Yisrael has Kedusha Shechina. It has the presence of God. What do you mean Eretz Yisrael has Kedusha Shechina? God is everywhere. The idea is, where does one feel closeness to God? God is everywhere. But we have a certain sense in Eretz Yisrael that we can feel the closeness to God, more so than we can feel it anywhere else. So if not for a special Gzeres HaKosov, if not for a pasuk indicating otherwise, I would have said that when you said vidui, which according to the Rambam is the mitzvah of Chiva, of returning to God, of coming close to God, I would say that you have to go to Eretz Yisrael to say vidui. So the Torah says, the Torah tells us that no, you could say vidui wherever you are. So, but in any case, this mitzvah of feeling close to God, which is part of the mitzvah of Chiva, of course, before one sins, certainly a person has to feel close to God. But the mitzvah of Chiva is to reconnect with God, to reestablish the relationship, or perhaps create a new relationship, whatever it might be. But to sense this closeness to God. So this mitzvah is not just when you do tshuva. It's an ongoing mitzvah, because the mitzvah of tshuva is an ongoing mitzvah. Yes, you do tshuva for kapara, you do tshuva for atonement. But even after you received atonement, the mitzvah of tshuva is to strengthen that closeness to God, to be on guard that you will not commit the same transgression again. You will not build that wall that separated you from God. The mitzvah of tshuva is a lifelong mitzvah. The Gemara, we paskin, it's machlokas in the Gemara, and it's machlokas Rishonim, how to understand the machlokas. But we paskin that even if one said vidui in previous years on Yom Kippur, he already attained atonement. According to our blessed Ben Yaakov, he has to say vidui every year Yom Kippur. Why does he have to say vidui? Because the Rambam says, Midarke HaTshuva, it's part of the approach of Tshuva. Sheyiyeh Hashav Tzoek Tamid, crying out to God constantly. What's the purpose of crying out to God constantly? But he has to reinforce that Tshuva. He has to reinforce that relationship. So to reinforce that relationship of being close to God, Tshuva is not just a meeting between God and man. Tshuva is almost, as the Haftorah of this week said, it tells us, it's like a marriage between God and man. Wherever that God, that you're constantly there with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, our sages tell us that Adam me makam kaparaso nivra. When God created man from earth, he took the earth from the spot of the altar, where the altar would be, from where he received atonement. Why is it? What's the idea that mimakom kaparaso nivra? But when man was created, that's when he establishes his relationship to God. God actually established his relationship with man. God blew his spirit into man. The spirit that God blew into man, according to most Rishonim, that's a chilikel kaimi mal. That's the godliness in him. And I've discussed the idea of kapara is in a sense, but as man sinned, there was a weakness in the relationship. There was a weakness in the relationship, in that closeness that existed between man and God. So, in a sense, the kapara, the atonement, the tshuva, the return, that's like being born again. In other words, it's reestablishing that new relationship. We talk about tshuva being identified with tahara. What is tahara? There are many examples of tahara, but the example that comes to mind most of the time is mikveh. When a person puts their head underneath the water of a mikveh, they go from a state of non-existence into a state of existence. So tshuva is this idea of, in a sense, being born again. My uncle mentions, and I've seen others say the same thing, just like we say, ger shin is gayer katan shenola dami. A ger is like someone that was born anew. So to a certain degree about tshuva is also ger shin is gayer katan shenola dami. And as the Rambam in Perik Beis of Hilchos Chiva says, that a Baal Tshuva has to see ani eni ish. I'm not that same person. I am a different person. Now, it's interesting, Rosh Hashanah, the main mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is for kol shofar, is the sound of the shofar. And I've mentioned many times, what is the difference between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim? Yom Kippurim, that's the 10th day of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, the last day. We understand how Yom Kippur is identified with Tshuva. There's fasting, there's vidui, there's everything. Rosh Hashanah, there's no vidui. According to that read, there's a short vidui. But Moshe to say there's no vidui. According to most opinions, there's no fasting on Rosh Hashanah. There are those that say, my great-grandfather, the Beis Halevi, he would fast on Rosh Hashanah also. But that's not the general opinion. I mean, even according to Beis Halevi, it wasn't the requirement. It was something that he felt that he should do. So how does Rosh Hashanah manifest itself as a day of tshuva? And I've mentioned many times, because a Jew who sins rejects Sinai. And as we say, if God brought us close at Mount Sinai, didn't give us the Torah, that would have been something great also. What would have been so great in coming to Mount Sinai, not getting the Torah? The answer is, at Mount Sinai, we, besides getting the Torah, we had revelation. We sensed the presence of God. How did the Jews sin and build a golden calf? He didn't perpetuate the experience of Sinai. Sometimes we perpetuate, we try. It won't work, but we try to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai without perpetuating the experience of Sinai. So the kol shofar, how did God make himself known at Mount Sinai? He's saying the Dabri, uva kol shofar hafata, you made your presence known at Sinai with the sound of the shofar. So the shofar is what made God's presence known. When we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, we say it's not enough for us to re-accept the Torah. That's something we do on Yom Kippurim when we say the vidui. We have to re-undergo the experience of Sinai, of understanding the importance of perpetuating that feeling, of constantly being there with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, constantly sensing his presence. And it's when we fail to sense his presence that we begin to sin. In the general vidur, not the vidur of Yom Kippurim, we say, Ana Hashem, please God. Chatasi avisi pashati, I sinned. Lefanecha, before you. Why have to say lefanecha? Because how did I come to sin? I came to sin because I made believe you weren't there. I didn't sense your presence. Sensing the presence of God is essential to assuring us that we won't return to the sin. The mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, we're dedicating ourselves to the idea of perpetuating that experience of constantly sensing the presence of God. So this is, now when man was created, we say in the Yom Kippur Tefillah, so my God, until I was created, I wasn't worth anything. I wouldn't have been worth anything. But now that I was created, it's like I wasn't created. What's the pshat? My father and my uncle always used to say over what Rav Kook said. Each person has a mission in life. And each person has a different mission in life. No two people have the same mission in life. And each person, their mission in life, they're put in a time when they can fulfill their mission in life. In other words, the Golim of today, if they were, let's say the Rambam, if he had been today, certainly would have been recognized as a great scholar. Not that people wouldn't have written against him because he studied philosophy, I don't know. But the maybe he wouldn't have studied philosophy today, who knows? But the Rambam was put at the time that he was able to most accomplish his mission in life. And if people from today were put in the time of the Rambam, it goes without saying they wouldn't have been able to accomplish. So in the Vidui of Yom Kippurim, we say, until I was created, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish that mission that you put me on this world. When I was born for to fulfill a certain mission. But now that I was created at a time that I could accomplish, that I could fulfill my mission. But I didn't, I sinned. In other words, from birth, we have a mission. And God created the world. God created the world. God created the world in an unfinished manner. Why? Because God wanted man to become his partner in building the world. And this mission was entrusted in him at the time of his creation. Torah tells us, God created man in his image. In the image of God, he was created. My father would always say, it's redundant. God created man in his image, and that's the image of God that he was created. So when it's repetitious. My father say, no, his is with a small h. Each person has a different image, a different mission in life. My mission is different than somebody else's mission. The Rebbe Reb Zusha would say, my father would always repeat it on Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe Reb Zusha would say, if they'll ask me, why wasn't I like Rabbi Akiva? I would say, because I wasn't Rabbi Akiva. If they ask me, why wasn't I like the Rambam? I'll say, because I wasn't the Rambam. When they'll ask me, why wasn't I like the Baal Shem Tov? I'll say, because I wasn't the Baal Shem Tov. And they'll ask me, Zusha, why weren't you like Zusha? Like Zusha should have been, like Zusha's mission was. I won't have anything to answer. Zusha was entrusted with his mission at the time that he was born. We all are trusted with our mission at the time we were born. And the mitzvah of Chiva is to return to that mission that we were entrusted at the time we were born. This is Adam Me'makom Kaparasa Nivra. Man was created from the place of his kapara, because man ain't tzadik bar sheyasa tov v'yechta. We have to return to our mission. We have to be like Gersh in his Gayer Katan Shenolad Dami. We have to see ourselves new, just as we were created now. And that's how we sense the presence of God. The presence of God manifests itself in knowing that we are God's partner. We are working together with God. We are not working alone. Now, Rosh Hashanah, we say, Sifrei Chaim is Sifrei Mesim. And we plead with God, Kasvenu b'Sefer Chaim, put us in the book of Chaim. And it's brought down that a person who is found to be a tzaddik, so he's in Sefer Chaim, he's a Rosh, Sefer Mesim, and other the Beinanim Kluyim V'omdim. What do you mean? There are so many Rishonim. They exist from year to year. As I mentioned, there is a process of living and there's a process of dying. Process of living is a process of coming closer to God. It ends in Olam Haba. But that's the process of living. What's the process of dying? The process of dying is, in a sense, moving away from God. Moving away from the Chelek Elokai Mimau, from the godliness that was put into us. Separating ourselves from God. So this is what it means. Because when we plead with God to write us in the book of life, we're not just asking for the ability to breathe. We're asking also for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help us, so Tamid, help us in feeling close to Him. Midarkei Teshuva, to continue in coming closer and closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what life is all about. When we say in the Torah in this week's Sedra that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave before us HaChaim Ves HaTov, Ves HaMaves Ves HaRa. Chaim is not just a reward, but it's more than that. Of course it's a reward, but the reward is one of having a certain perspective. It's an obligation, it's not just a reward. It's an obligation of seeing ourselves living to fulfill our mission, to God, with God, to be God's partner, to constantly sense His presence as we go together. We as partners of HaKadosh Baruch Hu go together to fulfill the mission that God entrusted upon us. So this is what the Psukim come and tell us, that we have to dedicate ourselves. This is what Chiva is. We were entrusted with a mission, and we were close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The soul, when man was created, Adam Arishon, according to Chaim Volozhin, the neshama was put in him. But when he sinned, the neshama was on top of his head. It was removed from inside him. We have to be constantly, yes, we don't have the neshama the way Adam Arishon had it in the first day of his creation. We have to be able to sense the presence of the neshama, to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we feel that closeness when we act together with Him and fulfilling the mission that He entrusted in us to be His partner. And this is what Rosh Hashanah is dedicated to. Rosh Hashanah is dedicated to the creation of man. We return to that responsibility that HaKadosh Baruch Hu entrusted upon us. And we can only do that if Kol Shofar Hafata, if we are able to perpetuate the experience of Sinai, of sensing the presence of God. That's an experience that was associated with the creation of man, which Rosh Hashanah commemorates.
If anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat. One question that we had, you answered already, and the questioner knew that you asked it. Another question was, given the very powerful incentives of Olam Haba and Gehenna, how can anyone do anything Lishma?
In other words, you could do things, of course, you don't want to be in Gehenna, but you have to focus. In other words, the question is, how do you value being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And you have to see the being closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You have to see the being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the ultimate state that a person achieves. That's even more important than the honor of Olam Haba.
If a person does tshuva, should he expect suffering to come his way to receive atonement?
It depends on the nature of the sin. Depends on the nature of the sin.
According to what Rabbi said, there's that medrash that when a baby is in his mother's womb, there's a malach teaching Torah, and then a malach pressed him underneath the nose and forgets the Torah. Is that symbolic that we were very close to Hashem, and then living life and kind of rediscovering Hashem?
It's more than that. It's the idea is that, in other words, sometimes I learned something when I was a young boy, and over the passage of years, I forgot it. But then when I learn it again, it's something that, because I learned it at one time, it's somehow I feel attached to it, and it's sort of becomes more, it's easier for me to comprehend. That's the idea. We have to have the understanding of Torah as not something external, but it's something that was part of us from the very beginning.
But not just Torah. Is it the fact? Is it that the fact that it before we were born?
Well, that same thing would follow. The same thing would follow, but it's talking about Torah. But it's the same thing that would follow. In other words, when you learn Torah, you feel this closeness, the closeness to when you learn Torah, you feel the closeness to that which the Torah commands.
Okay. Okay, someone is asking that at the beginning you quoted a pasuk lasus alacha latov, and you said, why does it say latov and not l'chaim? So would that be the same?
That's right. The answer is because l'chaim. The answer is because l'chaim means to fulfill my mission. So to fulfill my mission in life. L'chaim is not just to live, but it's to fulfill my mission in life of closeness. I said, because it's the process of living. The process of living is being close to God, coming closer to God, where the process of dying is not being dead, but the process of dying is coming away from God. Because the neshama, which represents the life of man, that's the chelik elokai mimal. That's the godliness in man.
Okay, a bit of a klutz kasha here, but the person who invented Zoom, the
person who invented what?
No, it's from me, so that's why I could say it's a klutz kasha.
Okay, all right.
So the person who invented,
want to embarrass anybody, I'll tell you.
If the person who invented Zoom, from the fact that we hear a share like this today, could it be that someone is accomplishing great things without even knowing that they did it or had that in mind when they did it?
That's called Nitzavim.
No, so I'm saying the person who invented Zoom, and for someone gets inspired by a show like this, do they get schar without knowing it?
So that's the story with Rome. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah. The
Okay.
Gemara in Avodah Zarah says
That's
that
true.
Rome will say to God, look, we built roads so the Jews should be able to go to the Beis Medrash. So God said, listen, the Jews used the roads to go to the Beis Medrash, but that's not the reason you built it. So that's the same thing. And the Brisker Rav gave an example. He said the Tsar, the Russian government built railroads to take the Jews to Siberia. And during World War II, the Jews used that to escape from the Nazis. He says, undoubtedly, those that built the railroads in Russia will come to God and say, we built railroads that saved so many Jews from the Nazis. So God will say to them, yes, the railroads saved the Jews, but that's not the reason you built it.
Okay, what's the best way to ensure that one's kavanah doesn't become tied to a reward when you perform a mitzvah?
Well, we start mito shelo lishma bo lishma. It starts off with shelo lishma. You can start off with shelo lishma, but ultimately, if you focus on the idea of closeness to God, and you focus on the importance of Torah, and you focus on the idea of having a mission of being a partner of God, then you will have a different. You will come to the idea, the realization of the Shema.
Was the Beis Halevi being lenient when he allowed people to fast on Rosh Hashanah?
That's
You
what
didn't say he
claimed.
allowed people. Didn't say he allowed people to fast. He fasted himself, right?
Yeah, so he claimed. A maskell said to him, he said, the Rabbanim today that we're talking, of course, over 120 years ago, maybe more, but about 140 years ago, Maskell said to the Beis Halevi, he said, the Rabbanim today, that time, they only give chumrah, stringencies. There's no leniencies. So the Beis Halevi said, I'm publishing a sefer, and in my sefer, I have 7 leniencies that go against the Shulchan Aruch. So the Maskell says, tell me the leniencies. He was very overjoyed. So he said, well, the first leniency is the Shulchan Aruch paskins, you're not allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah. And I paskin, you're allowed to fast on Rosh Hashanah. And then he gave 6 more leniencies like that. Okay. I don't fast on Rosh Hashanah. I'm letting you know. Okay.
Okay. There aren't any other questions here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here. God willing, do you think there'll be a share next Sunday?
Believe that, or yeah, there'll be a share next Sunday. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll be in touch then.
Thank you.